Welcome to lecture number 39. This is topic 3.4, the defeat of Reconstruction. The learning objective is to explain how Reconstruction era reforms were dismantled during the 19th century. Let's start with the defeat of Reconstruction. The official end of Reconstruction is generally understood to be 1877, marked by the Compromise of 1877, which resolved the disputed presidential election of 1876 between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel Tilden. In this election, 3 states had disputed electoral votes, the former Confederate states of Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. Up until this point, the election was tied, but there were competing sets of return for these 3 states. A commission was established to determine which candidate would be awarded the electoral votes for each of the states. The popular vote was won by Samuel Tilden, but as you can see, it's listed with an asterisk on the slide. This is because by this point, all but 3 of the 13 former Confederate states had been redeemed, that is, taken over by white Democratic politicians through tactics of violence and intimidation that kept black Republican voters from exercising their newly won rights. The term redeemed was often used by Southern Democrats to describe the process of regaining political control from the Republicans and reversing Reconstruction reforms. Ultimately, the compromise gave the presidency to the Republican candidate, Rutherford Hayes, with the promise that he would remove the last remaining Union troops from the South. The last states to be readmitted to the Union would be allowed to do so once these troops were withdrawn. After the Union troops were removed from the last Southern states, white Democratic governments took control of the remaining 3 states. Some of these governments began to rewrite their states' constitutions to include elements of de jure segregation. This meant that they would officially sanction measures of discrimination against black citizens, openly defying the 14th Amendment. These new constitutions often included provisions that laid the groundwork for Jim Crow laws, which would enforce racial segregation for decades to come. With the Compromise of 1877, Reconstruction was over, and conditions for African Americans began to deteriorate significantly. As we mentioned in a previous lecture, the right to vote, guaranteed by the 15th Amendment, was attacked almost immediately. In the 1875 Supreme Court case, United States v. Reese, the court ruled that the right to vote was not granted by the 15th Amendment. Rather, the amendment only prohibited states from imposing race-based restrictions on the franchise. This decision meant that the states could impose limitations that were race-neutral. This ruling significantly weakened the protections offered by the 15th Amendment and opened the door for discriminatory practices. The act that was overturned by this decision was the Enforcement Act of 1870, which had been intended to protect and enforce the newly ratified 15th Amendment. Some of the most effective restrictions used by white Democratic governments to disenfranchise black voters were poll taxes and literacy tests. Poll taxes created a financial barrier to voting, disproportionately affecting black voters. Literacy tests were designed to restrict voting to those who could read, but the tests administered to black voters were often purposely more difficult. They might be given an obscure clause from the state's constitution and asked to interpret its meaning. Whether a potential voter passed this test was often subjective and up to the discretion of the county clerk who controlled the voting rolls, and this discretion was frequently abused to ensure that black voters failed the tests. To protect the franchise for any poor or uneducated white voter who could not meet the poll tax or literacy test requirements, white Southern governments implemented grandfather clauses into all of these laws. These clauses stated that if a voter's grandfather had been able to vote in the 1860 election, then the person attempting to register to vote would be exempt from paying a poll tax or passing a literacy test. This automatically made all white voters eligible to vote, while the vast majority of black voters were excluded, since voting had not been a possibility for black men in southern states before the Civil War. The use of grandfather clauses was a clear attempt to maintain white political dominance while circumventing the 15th Amendment. The political cartoon on the screen calls out this hypocrisy of these restrictive laws, showing how uneducated white voters were able to continue voting while disenfranchising black voters who were equally or sometimes more educated than their white peers. African Americans were also subjected to an increase in racial violence. The goal of such violence was to disenfranchise black voters and keep them from exercising their right to vote through intimidation and threats of violence. This pattern of violence aimed at disenfranchising and disempowering black voters and black Republican politicians who had been elected to office during radical Reconstruction is something referred to as shotgun policy, where white mobs would attack black voters on Election Day and enter black areas of the cities and towns to indiscriminately kill black people. This violent backlash was particularly intense during the election of the 1870s, as white supremacists sought to prevent African Americans from achieving any political power. Examples of such violence include the Colfax Massacre in Louisiana, the Hamburg Massacre in South Carolina, and the Wilmington Insurrection in North Carolina in 1898, where all the black Republican legislators were ousted from the office and replaced with white Democrats. The Wilmington Insurrection is notable as the only successful coup d'etat on American soil, resulting in the overthrow of a legitimately elected government. As part of this violence, there were also lynchings, public extrajudicial executions that often involved torture. Typically, black men would be hanged, burned, and dismembered for alleged crimes, usually of a sexual assault on white women. In reality, however, those targeted by lynching were often successful black business owners or anyone who resisted white violence. Lynching served as a brutal tool of racial control, instilling fear in black communities. There were 3,745 documented cases of lynchings between 1889 and 1932, with the majority of victims being black. In some of the compiled statistics, there are lynchings of Italian Americans and others listed as white, but more often than not, those identified as white victims of lynchings were Mexican or Mexican Americans. Lynching was a public spectacle, with entire communities often coming out to witness the killing. The public was not only complicit by watching and not stopping the violence, but they also took parts of the mutilated body home as a souvenir. Photographs would be taken with people posing next to the body, and these images were made into postcards as mementos. This ghastly practice highlights the extent to which racial violence was normalized and even celebrated in parts of American society. Finally, African American women were also subject to sexual assault, powerless to defend themselves against white attackers. Any black man who attempted to stand up for them ran the risk of being lynched. This pervasive threat of violence created a climate of terror for African Americans throughout the South. Those who carried out this violence were often former Confederates and members of the Ku Klux Klan, a political terrorist group that embraced the doctrine of white supremacy. The Klan started in Tennessee in the early 1870s, but was suppressed in its first iteration through the help of Congress and the Enforcement Acts. Another political terrorist group, the White League, operated similarly but was more decentralized, with different White Leagues across the South looking and operating in slightly different ways. These groups played a significant role in undermining Reconstruction and restoring white dominance in Southern politics. By 1896, the elements of Jim Crow that were present across the South were solidified into law nationwide through the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson. This case challenged an 1891 Louisiana law that imposed segregation in train passenger coaches by having separate sections for white and black passengers. The law itself was unpopular among railroad companies because it incurred extra costs to provide separate facilities and placed a burden on their staff to enforce segregation. Black-led groups like the American Citizens Equal Rights Association of Louisiana also stood up and spoke out against this law. The case became a pivotal moment in the history of American civil rights, setting a legal precedent for segregation. The law was challenged by a Louisiana man named Omar Plessy. Plessy was 1/8 black, and by all counts, he was almost indistinguishable from a white man and had to alert the conductor or railcar employee that he was sitting in the wrong section. The Supreme Court ultimately sided with the Louisiana law in an 8-1 decision. The lone dissenter was Justice John Marshall Harlan, who likened the constitutionality of the law to that of the Dred Scott decision, another court case that claimed black Americans were not entitled to the same rights as citizens. Harlan's dissent would later be recognized as a prophetic condemnation of the court's decision. He accurately predicted the development of a more segregated society. The Plessy v. Ferguson case established the doctrine of separate but equal, which is what became the legal basis for this new racial segregation in American society. From this decision, there emerged segregated waiting areas, restaurants, and schools. The doctrine legalized the separation of facilities and rights, but in reality, the segregated facilities were rarely, if ever, equal to those reserved for white citizens. This ruling entrenched racial inequality and segregation in American life for more than half a century. There was an organized opposition to these segregation laws even after the Plessy case. In southern cities, there were boycotts and protests against segregated streetcars. There were even attempts to create competitive streetcar companies in some cities that would not segregate seating in their facilities. These early acts of resistance laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. The extent of Jim Crow laws across the South reached into every aspect of public life, including separate restrooms, drinking fountains, sections in auditoriums and theaters, and even phone booths. In some cases, separate facilities were left out altogether or did not exist at all for black people. For example, hotels, country clubs, swimming pools, golf courses, and public parks were often reserved for the sole use of white Americans. This systematic exclusion reinforced the idea of black inferiority and perpetuated social and economic disadvantages. The new legal segregation, compounded with the strict racial etiquette that black people were expected to adhere to in social life. They were to avoid eye contact with white people, and physical contact or handshakes were completely out of the question. If they visited a white person's home, they were expected to use the back door instead of the front door. They were often addressed by white people as boy or girl to further demean them, and in return, black people were expected to address whites with titles such as Mr., Mrs., Boss, or Sir. These social customs were enforced through both legal and extra-legal means, ensuring the continued subjugation of African Americans. The system of segregation finally began to be dismantled with the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which declared that separate education facilities were inherently unequal. This decision marked the beginning of the end of Jim Crow laws in the United States. And finally, here's a recap. Reconstruction ended with the Compromise of 1877, and Southern states began to legalize discrimination shortly thereafter. Voting rights were suppressed through poll taxes and literacy tests, and black Americans lived under the constant threat of racial violence with no form of protection. Finally, the 1896 Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson legalized segregation nationwide through the doctrine of separate but equal. This era represents one of the most regressive periods in American history, with the gains of Reconstruction being systematically dismantled. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/AFAM. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.